So we're going to move on to our next talk. And Julie, you can go ahead and set up your slides. We're pleased to have Julie Reichert Nguyen and Breck Sullivan, who are together going to be representing the Chesapeake Bay program. Julie is a natural resources specialist with the NOAA Chesapeake Bay office and coordinates the Chesapeake Bay program's climate resiliency work group. Her work focuses on assessing climate change trends and effects on marsh habitats and fisheries, and working with partners to incorporate resilience building strategies in restoration and conservation efforts. Breck is a physical scientist at USGS with an interagency agreement with EPA Chesapeake Bay Program Office. At the CBP office, she is Scientific Technical Assessment and Reporting Coordinator. So welcome you guys, and once your slides come up, oh, they look perfect. Take it away.
All right, can I be heard?
You can be heard. Your slides have kicked themselves out of the presentation mode.
Yeah, sorry, I had some difficulties. It muted me when I switched. So let me try one more time.
Okay, it looked good at first.
Okay, let's give this another go. Hopefully this will work. All right.
Perfect.
All right, so you should see the title slide and hopefully you can hear me okay.
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, Jordan, and I'm really happy to be here. So Breck and I are going to sort of tag team this presentation. So I'm Julie Reichert Nguyen. I'm with the NOAA Chesapeake Bay office, and I also coordinate the climate resiliency work group through the Chesapeake Bay Program Partnership. And my colleague Breck Sullivan is with the United States Geological Survey, and as mentioned by Jordan, she coordinates the Scientific Technical Assessment and Reporting team through the Chesapeake Bay program. So today we're going to talk about sort of enhancing partnership support. So we have this large partnership effort within the Chesapeake Bay program, and it's driven by the Chesapeake Bay Watershed Agreement. So we have a lot of folks that are working towards meeting the various goals that's identified in that agreement. And we have various teams that's helping out with that. And this is sort of a combination of partners that include federal, state, and local governments, nonprofit organizations, and academic institutions. And you'll see we have various goal implementation teams that deals with sustainable fisheries, habitat, water quality. As Pam had mentioned, there is a total maximum daily load in the Chesapeake Bay to try to meet our various water quality standards for dissolved oxygen and our aquatic life. We want to maintain our healthy watersheds. We have groups that work on stewardship and also partnerships with leadership and management. And this is all structured in a way that we have science support as well and policy support. And now with the climate resiliency work group, we actually sit under the Scientific Technical Assessment and Reporting team, which we refer to as STAR. But with climate, we're cross-cutting. We deal with a lot of cross-cutting issues. And so we work closely with a lot of the goal implementation teams, including Habitat, where they have the wetland work group. And Pam Mason is actually the chair of the wetland work group. So we work really closely with Pam on a lot of our collaborative efforts around wetland resilience. So again, with the Chesapeake Bay Watershed Agreement, there are quite a few marsh-related goals in there. We do have the climate resiliency goal that is to increase the resiliency of the Chesapeake Bay and watershed, including its living resources, habitats, and public infrastructure and communities to withstand these adverse effects from changing environmental and climate conditions. And wetlands are interesting, tidal wetlands, because they can provide a lot of benefits and to build resilience to climate change, but they're also in Chesapeake Bay quite vulnerable. And we are definitely, if you look at the sea level rise projections, our area is quite affected by sea level rise. And we also have subsidence. So we have land sinking and our sea levels rising. So sort of a double whammy. So here we have wetlands that can provide all these great benefits for resilience because they provide flood mitigation, as we were hearing from Pam in the last presentation, but there is also a lot of vulnerability. And we have this wetland outcome in our agreement where we do want to create or reestablish 85,000 acres of tidal and non-tidal wetlands enhance the function of additional 150,000 acres of degraded wetlands by 2025. And so we really are interested in understanding how sea level rise will affect our current wetlands regarding gains and losses, and looking at marsh migration. So I'm going to pass it. Oh, before I do that, I do want to mention with our climate resiliency work group, we do have some focus of our work group. Again, we're a science support team. And so we try to connect climate change research with the available data that's out there to assess trends and these likely impacts around sea level rise and other changing climate conditions. And we also aim to pursue, design, and construct these restoration and protection projects using our information that we get from our assessments to enhance the resiliency of the bay and the aquatic ecosystems. And particularly, we're looking at protecting from different climate change effects such as coastal erosion, coastal flooding, sea level rise, and more frequent intense storms. So now I'm going to pass it over to my colleague, Breck Sullivan, who's going to talk about the Chesapeake Program Science Needs Database and our science needs around wetland resilience.
Thanks, Julie. Hi, everyone. So with the focus of the climate resiliency work group that Julie just went over, there are various science needs that arise to support these actions. And these climate science needs, along with the science needs of all of the outcomes under the Chesapeake Bay Watershed Agreement, are tracked through a database. And this database helps focus existing science resources, leverage the research enterprise, and more effectively provide science to advance Chesapeake Bay Program's efforts and decision-making. And anyone can access this database with the link that we provided on the slide. We can also provide it in the chat afterwards. And you can filter based on your interests related to the outcomes at the Chesapeake Bay Program. Next slide, please. One of the climate science needs in the database is better understanding sea level rise and subsidence impacts related to wetland loss, migration, and adjacent land use considerations. So this was identified as a science need because in the Chesapeake Bay, we need to better understand factors such as non-uniform aspects of sea level rise, marsh migration potential, and targeted areas for restoration or conservation. Next slide, please. So some ongoing efforts of the Climate Resiliency Work Group and other teams at the Chesapeake Bay Program are to help answer previous science needs that I just mentioned, such as conducting exploratory analyses of wetland loss and adjacent land use considerations from sea level rise scenarios. This is something that we have already been able to start work on and produce some results. Another project is synthesizing data for wetland targeting. This one is underway and we should have a final deliverable soon. And then building a network across the bay to identify collaborative tidal marsh adaptation projects. And this is one that we will hopefully start completing in the next few months, and we'll reach out for the next year until the deliverables are final. And with these efforts, we've created partnerships with academic institutions, state agencies, nonprofits, and have helped student learning and experience through internships. Next slide.
Yep, so I'm going to talk a little bit more about these different efforts and sort of what we're trying to achieve with them. So with this exploratory analysis, vulnerability analysis that we did, we were really interested in using some existing tools and kind of look at how can we quantify how sea level rise will affect wetland acres and how it would affect adjacent land use. So this is the Sea Stream internship opportunity that Breck mentioned, and it was great. We explored this with our Chesapeake Bay Program GIS colleagues and the land use work group, and we really wanted to look at the NOAA Sea Level Rise Viewer, and I put a link here. There's a lot of great information there on the viewer that I don't have time to go over in this presentation, but it would be for us something that would be useful from a screening tool perspective. Again, I want to mention it's a screening tool to try to understand where sea level rise will occur, how it's going to affect wetlands, and how it's going to affect the adjacent land if we're looking at different marsh migration opportunities. And so you'll see here on the left, you can look at the different sea level rise. This is just sort of a base level of an unnamed marsh by West Point, Virginia. And in the viewer, there is a marsh migration tool where you can set different parameters. You can view by different scenarios, different sea level rise scenarios. You can set accretion rates, and it gives you a general sense of what the sea level rise would look like and what time frame that would occur. And you can set different scenarios. If it's the intermediate high scenario, which kind of corresponds with more increases in the greenhouse gas concentrations. And so you can get sort of a sense, a screening level, what's going to be happening to a marsh. And we were interested in taking this information from the NOAA Sea Level Rise viewer and looking at their mapping confidence information around inundation and overlaid that with what the Chesapeake program uses for their land use model. And their land use model includes information on forested land, agricultural lands, and wetlands. And we were really interested to kind of incorporate sort of this uncertainty type information in trying to set what would those management targets look like. And so you'll see here we have a graph here on our preliminary results for wetlands, and then we have also preliminary results for adjacent agricultural lands for that unnamed marsh that I showed in the previous slide. And we looked at different scenarios. So we had 1 foot of sea level rise, 2 feet, and 4 feet. And those are the sort of the projected years in an intermediate high global scenario that would see around 2030, 2050 to 2080. And we wanted to see how acres were going to be affected and what was sort of the confidence around that. And so you see in the preliminary results for wetlands, orange represents that inundation that there's low mapping confidence, and the blue represents high confidence. So if you were a manager, you may be looking at this different confidence levels, and that may help you determine various decisions as you look through time in these different sea level rise scenarios. And for this particular unnamed marsh, we can see that through time, the confidence increases, the mapping confidence increases with inundation as we go through time, and where for the most part, the majority of the acres of the existing marsh there would be pretty much drowned out, and it would be open water. And so this really, you can start seeing happening maybe around the 2050 timeframe where that confidence increases. So maybe there's some management triggers that need to be put in place, especially if that marsh provides critical habitat or other benefits with flood mitigation to those nearby agricultural lands, that you may want to look at this time frame and place some management triggers for different strategies. And then we have preliminary results for the agricultural lands, and you'll see there was around 78 acres of adjacent agricultural lands. And again, through time, they're not so much affected. There is some inundation happening when you get to further in time at 2080, around 11 acres are being affected at high confidence. But again, you're going to be losing most of the marsh that was probably providing more flood mitigation benefits, which this type of analysis doesn't show. And we would love to like sort of build in more data, as like Pam presented, to really understand what is that flood mitigation benefit. And when we were working on that sort of preliminary exploratory analysis, the land use work group, they found that depending on sort of the land use data you're using, if it was the NOAA sea level rise data, or if you're looking at SLAM data, we actually found some discrepancies with how the results would show. So that brought us to this other funded project for targeting wetland restoration with existing data that was also incorporated a marsh migration model comparison. And this project is actually being supported by the Virginia Institute of Marine Science. And we're looking towards synthesizing this available data around shoreline condition, the wetland area, and these migration corridors, and looking at these different marsh migration models and comparing the results, but applying this synthesized information in sort of a conservation targeting type perspective at this local scale that can help influence the decision making. So in the end of this, we're really hoping for a data methodology that will make this process accessible and replicable in other areas and communities, given that these type of analyses are time intensive and require a lot of expertise. And the goal of this project is really to try to create this process that we could start replicating in other areas in Chesapeake Bay. Now, this is an ongoing project and it wraps up around the fall timeframe of this year. So we're hoping we can present the results later on. And then we also have an upcoming funded project that Breck mentioned, which deals with partnership building. So we have this targeting information that we're going to get, but we also need partners to implement where we identify good areas to do this marsh resilience work. And so we're trying to bring together folks to identify some collaborative marsh adaptation projects. And we're doing that by aligning stakeholder organizational and geographic priorities with resilience research opportunities, because we also are very interested in how effective these resilience strategies may be. So actually aligning implementation with researchers could help us answer some of those questions, and connecting these stakeholder resilience metrics for targeting these restoration projects, which could include what Pam presented in the previous presentation, and then really identifying these potential partnership networks to implement some larger scale tidal wetland restoration projects. And for the climate resiliency work group, eventually we want to put all this information into a suite of indicators. So we have a good understanding of sea level rise, what our loss or gains in wetlands look like, that can help us develop some climate resilience indicators to indicate how prepared are we for this change. So that could include some policy decisions, for instance, like in the change in land use designation to allow for marsh migration. I'm going to pass it back to Breck to talk about our knowledge gaps and science needs and wrap up our presentation.
Thanks, Julie. So from these efforts that, I think there's some feedback. Okay, that sounds better. Thanks. So from the efforts that Julie just went over, you can see that we were not only just able to answer the science need that I had mentioned on a previous slide, but we are also able to address other knowledge gaps around coastal wetlands. So you can see how with all these different funded projects and different relationships that we've been able to build with partners, we're able to support and accomplish some of these science needs that are located in the database, and then ultimately help us progress and reach our goals and outcomes under the Chesapeake Bay Watershed Agreement. So next slide, please. So this is our last slide, and we wanted to show it because we hope to build upon the new developments and collaborations to tackle other hot topic science needs related to ecosystem services. Because wetlands serve more than just one purpose, as I'm sure this group knows, from habitat to sequestering carbon to flood mitigation. So with these additional science needs that we have, we hope this workshop can help build our partnerships to help identify approaches or tools that can be applied across regional landscapes to strengthen science. Thank you.
Thanks, you guys. Thanks to both the presenters. Fantastic work. We have a handful of minutes for some Q&A that Joe can help facilitate.
Yeah, Joan and I will help with that. And thank you very much to Julie and Breck and to Pam for those very informative presentations. We have a chance now to have people from the participant group ask you questions, and just checking in with Joan first. Did any questions pop in the chat, and as people are beginning to write their questions in?
Yes, Joe, thank you. So there was a question directed to Pam from Kathy. The features in your NNBF tool were very useful. Who are some of the users of the tool? I think you mentioned CRMC. Do local communities use the tool?
Great question. So I'm normally really great with acronyms, but CRMC, I don't know that one.
Oh, we call our Coastal Resource Management Council CRMC. I thought you mentioned a similar group.
Oh, yes. Okay, so we have, well, it's the closest thing we would have to that would be the Coastal Policy Team in Virginia. And then, of course, you know, Julie mentioned the sort of Chesapeake Bay governance. The folks that we do know that folks are using the tool. So I just attended actually a charrette in the city of Hampton where they're trying to implement what they call Resilient Hampton, which was a framework they developed a couple of years ago. And that the map, we actually ended up using our natural nature-based features map and some of the data, because when we did that original mapping for the nature-based features, we actually masked the portions of Virginia that are higher than 10 feet. So even though it was like, so they're using the information to help identify locations, but they're also just using the basic data that we mapped to help them sort of frame where they want to focus some of their decision making. So that turned out to be an interesting sort of unintended benefit as opposed to unintended consequence. So we do know that the local governments are using the information, and they are definitely using the Living Shorelines decision-making support tool, given that we have our fairly new legislation in Virginia to require living shorelines wherever suitable. And so the suitability tool is being used quite a bit.
Awesome. Thanks so much for that answer.
Joan, anything else in the chat? Questions in the chat?
Yeah, there's a question for Julie and Brack from Jason. How will the change in wetland type, for example, tidal fresh wetlands to brackish or salt wetlands, impact ecological services as climate changes? Sea level rise causing higher salt levels.
Yeah, I can tackle that one. So we actually didn't have time to present all the different projects that we are supporting through the climate resiliency work group. So there was actually another project where we were working with our partner, Virginia Tech, where they were doing a synthesis study where they were reviewing all the available information on wetland BMPs, so looking at wetland type and how climate change would affect the ecological services around the water quality question and reducing nitrogen, phosphorus, and suspended sediment. And what really came out of that project is that we're lacking research to really understand the answer to that question. So that is actually what we're working on now, is reviewing that report. And it is publicly available, so I'll try to find the link and drop it in the chat. But we're trying to review the report and identify those science needs, which would then get incorporated into the STAR Science Needs database that we want to reach out to our partners to see if we can get more research to understand how these wetland types and the transition. And you can see some information from like the sea level rise viewer tool. If you look at their Marsh migration tool, that shows and again, this is a screening tool, so you would have to actually go to the site to really understand the marsh characteristics, but sort of the transition from like salt marsh to more brackish and to like freshwater. And so it gives you a sense maybe where how much transition may be happening, but you really need to go to site to understand those characteristics. But it could be used as a screening tool to maybe identify some areas for research projects that to sort of evaluate these ecosystem services.
Thank you, Julie and Pam, for those great answers to the questions. We really just have about time for one quick question, if there's one other thing.
Yeah, well, there's a quick comment here from Kevin. I think establishing a standardized method for carbon sequestration of tidal wetlands should be a high priority.
Okay. Well, I think with that, we will thank these panelists so much and turn it back to Jordan.